Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, and also for really making this possible. We've been planning this and plotting it for, I don't know, it feels like a year, right? Months and months and months. And I want to thank President Corey also, who's somewhere here, for welcoming us, and Naila Osline, who is also a key organizer here at Biola, and Tessa Blumenberg at Enrique's studio. I met with some faculty today and talked about how I run into really interesting people from Biola all over the place. I very much value this place and its tradition of faith and intellect hand in hand. So I'm thrilled to be here tonight and thrilled to have Enrique with me as my conversation partner. And I want to just flag before we begin that it's always complicated to talk about something visual, to talk about art. But I don't see that as problematic with you because you are an artist and a philosopher. So I'm going to really draw you out as a philosopher, and we will explore your ideas and let that be an entry point to your art, rather than I think the other, often you're interviewed as an artist and your philosophy comes out of that. And I think that, it may happen that we paint some verbal pictures as we talk about your works of art. So let's just plunge right in. You were born in a small town in Cuba into the socialism there of the 1960s. And that's a really interesting time and place to be born. Also, that socialism was officially atheist. I wonder how you would describe the religious and spiritual background of your childhood there.
Cuba was probably the least religious country in Latin America, even before the revolution.
Yeah.
And by 1964, when I was born, there were no churches. Our churches were not really part of the community. My parents sort of held on to their sort of Catholic God, even though it played very little role into our lives. And most of the Cubans I knew were into Santeria or Espiritismo, which were other traditions.
Right.
And sort of the magic of that made the challenges of communism, the migration, and all of that more in some ways more manageable for people.
Mm-hmm.
But then after that, I went to Spain, which was a little different, and Puerto Rico.
Right. And how old were you when you left Cuba?
I was 7.
Okay. I mean, so you were quite young, but it also is interesting for me to think about living in a time and place when revolution was a living idea. I mean, do you think that imprinted you, even at that young age?
Oh yeah, I mean definitely. I mean this was a time that the revolution was there were many problems that we were facing because of the shortage of many things.
Yeah.
But it's still the idea that this big change has happened around us. There was a certain utopian feeling floating in the society still.
Yeah.
And it was hard not to get touched by that as a kid, even though my parents themselves were against revolution. But I was intrigued by it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was hugely aspirational.
It was.
Yeah.
It was. Even for the little town we lived in, I think many people still felt that things were possible.
Right. So, as Jonathan described in the introduction, you then grew up and seemed to be becoming a physicist. And what I've read is that you went on a 5-day retreat in the winter of 1990 at Pigeon Point Lighthouse. And it was after that you left physics for art. So tell us what happened there.
Yeah, it was a crisis.
Did you know you were in crisis when you went there?
Yeah, that's why. You know, physics have been my life in many ways. I was interested in literature and painting since I was very young, but physics and mathematics were the most exciting things for me. And when I was a teenager, I had this sense that they were going to give me the answer to these questions. I always felt that I didn't understand enough about the world and physics.
Did you like invent a laser in Puerto Rico in high school?
I did. I work at a research lab, and then I built this laser, and it was very exciting. Yeah. And I work at a nuclear accelerator at Cornell, then I work at a place called Brookhaven. And I was really destined to do that for my life. But as I got older, when I got to Berkeley, I was painting all the time. And what I wanted to do was paint. And it got to the point that I really had that crisis. I felt like I had to make a choice. And it was really my first rebellion ever. And I went to this lighthouse. I drove down from Berkeley to this lighthouse and ensconced myself in the little house there for 5 days. And when I came out, I drove back to San Francisco knowing I would be an artist, although I didn't know what that meant.
What did you do with that insight then? What came next? Did you?
It was much slower. It sounds more dramatic, but then after that, then it's the real nuts and bolts of how to make it happen. So I work as a scientist. I dropped out of the doctorate program. I was doing the doctorate and the MFA at Berkeley at the same time. I dropped out of both and worked as a scientist trying to build enough money to be able to do things, designing lasers. And then I moved to Oakland and saw my works in the parks in San Francisco, trying to figure out what was next. And that was a terrible time.
A terrible time?
Yeah. My parents were distraught. I was the oldest in the family. We have been immigrants, quite poor in Spain and so on. And I have always done well in school, and the promise was that I was going to be a successful person. And here I was having a crazy dream.
Although supporting your art habit by building lasers is still more impressive than supporting your art habit by being a waiter or something.
Yeah, it was odd to say to people like what I did sort of with my day job. But it also took some credibility out of me being an artist. When I would say, well, I'm an artist, but I'm also a physicist, it seemed always like it was a hobby in some ways.
Right.
So, but yeah, it was. I felt like for a while there, I felt like I have thrown away. My advisors at Berkeley thought I've thrown away everything I have worked for. So there was those days in Oakland were rough.
It seems to me, though, that that the scientist in you is very much alive in your approach and philosophy of art, in the way you, and in your art. Is that something that you are aware of?
Yeah, you're right. It is alive, even though sometimes people don't realize it. I think that one of the most important ways in which it's alive is the treatment I have towards my studio. To approach it not as a factory has become very much the way of artists looking at the studios in the last 40 or 50 years, but rather as a laboratory, as a cross between laboratory and a monastery, that kind of hybrid place. And that's one way that I learned from my times on the labs. Also, the process of inquiry that I used for my work owes a lot to my training as a scientist.
How's that?
When I take on a new project, rather than building up on the successes of the past or what I have done before or what my dealers expect, I go back to the holes of my process, the things that I didn't understand well, and I go into those. And I find that that's a very typical thing of scientists to do. I also try to be rigorous and unfriendly towards my own biases and assumptions. And I think I also owe that to physics. my interest in philosophy, I think, comes from physics. And finally, and this is maybe the most important of all the reasons, I think the arts have become extremely apologetic to the sciences, partly because science have been so successful over the last 200 years. So I think in many of my experiences with academic art and art theory has been the tendency to want to be scientific or pseudoscientific. And when I came to art without apologies, and that gave me a great deal of freedom.
Mm. You know, I think the same thing could be said of theology as a discipline trying to justify itself in academic terms inside the academy. It doesn't have to do it at a place like this, but it's interesting. I'd never thought of the arts that way. I mean, here's something that someone else wrote about you that also, in another way, evoked this, the physicist to me and you. For Martinez Celaya, each work is an effort, and maybe you won't agree with how he's describing you. For Martinez Celaya, each work is an effort to discern a stability and clarity that lies beneath the murkiness of experience, an order or a structure that he calls truth, not art for art's sake, but an instrument for understanding in a world that is opaque and uncovering a deeper order that underlies what is obscured by the appearances of disorder. Seems to me that could also be describing physics or, again, even theology.
Yeah. I mean, I think that pursuit of truth and that inquiry, sometimes at great expense, joined, all those enterprises. And I think sometimes that's what makes my work sort of, to me, indistinguishable from pursuing it in philosophy or poetry. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it feels like an instance just to be doing it as painting, but tomorrow I can do it through writing or some other pursuit.
There's even a way that you've described painting that evokes that for me, the craft of it, or even the way you understand what's going on. You talked about, though we see, as an observer, we would see painting as something that is happening on a surface with materials. And you said, in an interesting painting, images fight back and their meanings play hide and go seek with materials. And their meanings play hide and go seek with materials. That is such an interesting, that image is going to change the way I look at any painting from here on out.
I think paintings are odd in the sense that it seems to us that everything that is important is on the surface and visible. Unlike, say, science, we expect that we have to go in deep to understand what's really at play in an equation or something. But that's very deceiving. I think paintings have a complexity, a relationship to presence and reference in the work of art, the tension between what seems to be and what is.
Right. Well, and that is such a theme in physics now also, that that our senses simply, deceive us or are so limited in what we can discern of what's actually going on.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. I think and that's what makes it so interesting. That's why I think establishes the connection between contemporary, at least physics from the last 100 years, and a lot of the most interesting things about the possibilities of art making as not a passive vessel in which to put some idea, but rather a very active process of engagement and experience.
Mm-hmm. This idea that Einstein had, this dialogue and debate that goes on within science of whether discoveries are, whether something like E equals MC squared was invented or discovered, whether truth is invented or discovered. Is that an interesting analogy for you in terms of the work you do, your artwork, the ideas that come to you, the images that come to you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's exactly how I see them. I think I feel, oddly enough, that I have relatively little role in my work in some manner. And I have ideas, for example, like I think all great paintings are the same in some manner. So if I look at a Velázquez or Leonardo, I find really that there are different embodiments of the same, pointing to the same place. So I think that what the artist is doing is finding their own way to clean some sort of glass in which to look somewhere. And each artist may have his or her own way to do that. But what is pointing towards is already in some manner. Which seems like a strange thing to say, but that's what I feel like is happening in the studio. I never feel like I can take credit for much of what I do.
Yeah, no, I've heard musicians talk this way. Like, actually, I'm thinking of Rosanne Cash. She said to me, it's like it's like you catch songs. Like they're out there to catch. And I was thinking a minute ago how you said that when you start a new project, you go back to a question or a hole in what you had known, and you start there, and then you kind of hear you saying, then you discover what the next project is, or it's given to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think of my work as an inquiry, and that inquiry, the goal of that inquiry is truth in some manner. So something that is an inquiry and has truth in it has a certain independence from the means that you use to get there. I mean, at the end of the day, the means sort of drop out if it's really an inquiry into some form of truth. So that's why I go back to these holes of the past, rather than trying to build a practice on the successes of the past. I try to build a practice on the failures of the past, of the missing parts, to see if I can map out a clearer sense of where things are.
What are you working on right now? Just like to put some, to tie these ideas to a specific project.
So I'm working on a body of work that opens next month in New York, I just finished it, and pointing to, just before I did a show called Empires that looked at ambitions and illusions in some manner, and now I'm looking at the aftermath of that. What happens after those ambitions have been played out? So there's a sense of the discovery of the end of that journey. And they're only paintings. Usually I do other things as well, but these are only paintings, and they have as much to do about the nature of painting as they do about these other ideas, which are, of course, indistinguishable from one another.
Yeah. So I want to talk about some passions and themes that run through your work and through your thinking and writing. And actually, why don't we pick up on that one, the idea of empires. You have this phrase, the dialectical friction between the domestic and the epic. I don't know if you did that if you said that in the context of empires, but I mean, here's something you wrote. That despite you had an early interest in classic empires like Rome, the empires that matter most to me now are the smaller empires of day-to-day living, constructed by promises and shaped by our drive, our accomplishments, and our failures. These are big and small empires built around our hopes and around our scorns, empires of place as well as of memory, or today in the land and of tomorrow in the sea.
Yeah. I was going through a big transformation in my life when I took on this project of empires. And I looked at I got into this big argument with a Dartmouth professor what empires are. But my empires were these empires that I saw growing up, sort of my mother's dressers or the dust on top of some book. And these kinds of empires that one of the qualities they have is sort of failure built in, certain futility in the adventure of those ambitions. And that dialectic that I just spoke about between the epic and the domestic, I think artists are usually artists of the epic or artists of the domestic. But what I'm interested in is the friction between these two spheres, the sort of domestic spheres of our everyday lives, children, families, are sort of a small goal, so to speak, and sort of these larger movements of time and history and God, these kinds of larger ideas. And the two of them rub against each other, and that friction between the domestic and the epic is a source of a lot of my work. So the notion of someone like Alexander the Great, for instance, this sort of grand ambition and then dying in a very private death, and a horrible one at that, is very interesting to me. So what I am looking at is, what I'm interested in is always sort of the small break-ins, the small fractures.
At risk of stretching this too far, I feel like that friction is so much with us now. What's happening out there on a grand level, and I think national political level, but also globally, feels very relevant. It feels epic, and it feels connected to our lives, and yet it's hard to get a handle on that or to know how to be working with it.
Yeah, I mean, there's sometimes a tendency to speak in numbers, in terms of numbers or groups, to me, everything always breaks down to the individual suffering, individual failure, the dreams and how that's been played out for each person. And no matter what group you belong to, I think that individuality of suffering and possibility and hope is the fundamental building block of human experience. And it is only to that art can say anything. Art can say very little about groups or general movements. That's left maybe for other fields like sociology. So I have tried to sort of make sure that my work stays in those areas that art can show or reveal something and not take it other places. Like art is a terrible way to do politics, for instance.
And I think consciousness is, obviously it's one of these epic things, but it runs, and it is the theme of philosophy. It's a special passion of yours, right? It's something that you write about and think about, and it makes its way into your art.
Yeah. I mean, I think it started when I was very young. I mean, it's a sense of my own sense of lack, of missing, always feeling like there was too much fullness to the world and I understood so little of it. And sort of consciousness is at the center of that awareness. And sort of my preoccupation with consciousness, I think it starts in my lack of consciousness of what is around me. So, I mean, in some ways, my whole entire interest in philosophy comes from my sense of being missing out on the fullness of reality.
Does that evolve as you move through life? As you get older, as you raise children? Do you have any sense that you perceive more of the fullness of reality?
I would like to say yes, but I don't think I can. I mean, I know more things, but I also know that sort of as the boundary of my knowledge has expanded, so has the horizon of what I don't know.
Right.
So the more I know, the more I know that I don't know.
Yeah.
So it has been tricky. And for example, having children, I feel like I know a lot less now than when I first had my kids. So yeah, so my feeling is constantly one of deficit.
Have you been are you following the science, the kind of scientific pursuit of consciousness now that's emerging?
The neuro.
Yeah, I feel like it's so much at the beginning, and I think any even the top people in neuroscience would say that this is we scarcely know how to approach consciousness itself, but it is interesting that at least the question is being asked, I think.
Yeah, no, it is fascinating. I think about it all the time in terms of how, machine, how the consciousness and computers and things like that will eventually evolve. I mean, at one moment, these man-made objects develop consciousness. And what's the definition of that? So I'm very intrigued by that. Not to go too far because this is a little bit of a rabbit hole, but there's a way to look at our works as consciousness.
Works too.
As rather than just be representatives or embodiments of a consciousness of the producer, they themselves having some consciousness that gets animated upon engagement. There's nothing intelligent I can say about it other than a feeling that I have that this is the case.
And that perception of that consciousness is in the engagement of the person, of people with that artwork.
Yeah, that there's somehow in that interaction, that experiential engagement, something new, which is neither the artwork, not the viewer, the person engaging it, is but a third thing that comes in. It's not just in Donatello's David. It's not just Donatello's consciousness there. There's something else at play, and which is, I think, indirectly related to the question of truth. So when you stand in front of the Donatello, something unfolds, and that unfolding is an awareness that points to consciousness.
Mm-hmm. And would that be the same with music, with all the art forms?
Maybe I don't know that much about other things, but
tell me an example of you experiencing that with a piece of art.
One of the most obvious examples, I think, and it happens to me every time I encounter any work by Van Gogh, no matter where it is. I was at the Hermitage doing my project there, and I went upstairs, and I found a piece I had never seen reproduced or anything there. Mm-hmm. And the moment I see it, something happens. There's an intelligence at play in the work itself, and a sense of something I can only describe as a consciousness in that work that engages me, forces me to be a witness, forces me to be a conversation partner, places me in a very unstable place. And there's an instability in that exchange that is more simply than just looking at a bunch of marks and thinking about Vincent might have made them or something like that. And this is a rare thing, I think, but I will suggest that somewhere around that, one could construct a definition of what art is as opposed to an art activity, is when something has the capacity to embody consciousness in a way that it can be unfolded.
Over hundreds of years.
Or hundreds of years, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe this is what art is.
And I think that's an interesting distinction too. That there are works of art that convey that, and what did you say, art activities? Because I don't think you would say also either that every painting has that consciousness or conveys.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you go to a museum and you look around, most works are forever trapped in their moment in a way that they are completely historical. And something historical is hard to have consciousness, really.
Yeah.
But then the great works of art are always ahistorical. Regardless of the historical condition, they speak to you in the present.
Right.
And that presentness of the work of art is what I am suggesting brings about this engagement with consciousness. And those things are the work. That's somewhere around there is that I would try to construct a definition of what art is.
That's so interesting to think about. And also, one reason I feel wary of all of this kind of fantasizing and also catastrophizing about machines becoming conscious is that we have such a little minuscule grasp of our own consciousness, or even when you talk about this, of that consciousness that is embodied in works of art. We have no idea what that is, so how can we implant it in our machines now, however smart they are?
Yeah, I think even ourselves, I find myself that it's remarkably easy to be unconscious through a great deal of life. And then in unconscious engagement, it's hard to then make a big argument for consciousness. I think wakefulness and consciousness are somehow related.
Yes. Another theme of yours that recurs is memory. Memory and displacement. And how would you describe what you mean by displacement?
I think there are different ways that I use that term displacement, but I think it's a delocalizing, a sense of finding yourself in a different place, not just physically, but perhaps an altered state of awareness, or a sense of have missed something out, a near miss that somehow displaces you for where you thought you were.
Yeah.
And I think the relationship to memory, I'm not so interested in memories, like my memories, but memory itself. And I think displacement carries in tow like the wake of memory, of where you were.
I wonder if you would read, you told me that you don't like reading, so we'll see how this goes. This is from this Poetry in Process. Maybe you can say a little bit about this volume. And then this poem that you wrote, It Was Not Time or Circumstance, from 2000.
I just realized I don't have my glasses.
You want me to read it?
Could you read it?
Yeah. Would you say a little bit about this book?
Yeah. So this was a book that was assembled around an exhibition called Poetry in Process, and it was an interesting conversation between the curator and I about the idea of poetry. When artists talk about poetry and the work being influenced by poetry, they almost always mean the content of the work. The work, they're inspired by a poet, and then they make the work to have the imagery or whatever. I'm interested in poetry as a certain kind of foundation of truth, a certain workings of metaphor. And we're trying to look at that from the point of view of the very process of making work as suggestive of pointing to poetry.
Okay, so here's this poem, which I think I saw it, because you have these notebooks that accompany some of your works and exhibits, and they get published. They're really fascinating if you have a chance to see them. They're handwritten, and it's basically the notes you take. It's basically a journal, right? A journal of the process. So I saw this written in one of those notebooks with words crossed out, and then here it appears very all neat and tidy on the page. It was not time or circumstance that displaced your memory. It was concentration. Then the whole house filled with birds, flapping their wings, shaping the air into snowballs of sound, which they threw against corners long ago left to silence. The yard, abandoned to weeds, had the flowers of laughter, and the window flickered light over the porcelain fish, which for all time jumped from the dark crystal table. I'm totally fascinated by it was not time or circumstance that displaced your memory. It was concentration. And I have no idea what you're saying there. So please explain.
I think that I find that sometimes in my experience of some people and some events, the only way to move past them, the only way to survive them in some manner, is with some sort of sometimes seemingly heroic effort, almost a practice of forgetfulness, that you have to every day wake up again and forget them again and forget them again, until that practice of forgetting them becomes sort of your everyday thing. And you know, that seemed like a love poem there that you read, but it was a poem to a moment of my childhood. And yeah, it was effort.
It was a hard moment.
It was a hard moment, not because something happened to me, but because of the fullness of that moment, and those conditions, and everything that the world around it, the world of the people around them, the feelings of those things, you know. It brings together a great deal of memories of departure and so on, and who I was and who other people around, and required you know, a sustained effort to not sink into that place and never come back. And that's the thing with memories. That's the thing with certain circumstances, that they're so vast that if you don't keep swimming against that current, it will draw you back and you will never recover.
So a phrase that comes up in your writing and in what people write about is this notion of hinge moments. And I think you just described that, standing before a Van Gogh painting. And actually, I recently, I was just in Minnesota a week ago, I met a Biola alum who talked about standing in front of one of your paintings, and essentially, she didn't use the phrase hinge moments, but she said, I stood there and that changed me. I walked away and I was different. And it seems to me that one of your projects that it feels like it was important to you was your Berlin work, Schneebett, that you did for the Berlin Philharmonic. writing about, well, would you just, I mean, it was about Beethoven and Beethoven's deathbed, but it was about a lot more than that.
Yeah. That project came at a very important time, I think, for me and my thinking about what art was about. I was really thinking as a total work of art, rather than individual pieces, rather a total collective and a total experience that involved everything I had to offer: writings, assembling of structures, interacting with the public. In that case, the Berlin Philharmonic itself was involved. They opened the season with Symphony Number 9.
Sorry.
From Beethoven and so on. So all that interaction. But it was also a reflection on the bed of death, Heidegger's notion of the bed of death, the idea that the present is heightened by an awareness of the temporary quality of life. And I was looking at Beethoven in particular, which I read a lot about him, those last convalescent months, and what they were from Beethoven, and the things that he was trying to negotiate with the past, with his history, with his family.
And he was deaf, right? He was losing his hearing.
Yeah.
Even as he was continuing to compose music, which is so incredible.
It is incredible, and that was very much a part. That was very much a part of what the work was about. That it was not just that he couldn't hear; it's that he heard ringing. So it's worse than not hearing. So, yeah. Right,
and yet he wrote the late quartets in that state, right? Which are such. I would say that the late quartets for me were hearing that music at a really complicated time in my life was kind of a hinge moment.
Yeah, well, so I'd read this passage of him writing music on his white bed, and how it was soaked with sweat, and that's what made me decide to do this frozen bed covered in snow. It was a metal bed that through the refrigeration system became covered in snow, and it was a desolated bed. And I used the drawings that existed of Beethoven's bed to recreate it. And every time I looked at it, I thought of this passage from Maynard Solomon's about Beethoven's sweat-soaked bed.
It's interesting, too, when you write about that period of Berlin. So that's mid-'90s Berlin. And I spent a lot of my 20s in a very different Berlin before the wall came down. This was a period before so Germany had been reunited, but it was a period before the Bonn government relocated to Berlin. There were still bullet holes in a lot of those buildings in East Berlin, which was true when I was there as well. They'd just never been repaired. So the past was just physically alive. And you wrote that this project considered the end of it, or that you were in the midst of the end of an epoch and the consequences of displacement. That Berlin at that time suggested a mood, a way of being, which I had not understood before and still do not understand well. I wondered if you'd say some more about that, because that feels like it was bigger also than that time, that place and time.
I think Berlin at that time had this sense of collective memory. It was just the whole city held together. In the windows, when you look up to those windows, you still feel that you can see that past in those windows. Everywhere I turned, I felt that it was there. And through that collective memory and I went there armed with sort of the poetry of Paul Celan and Heinrich Heine and people like that. So in many ways, it was my own exploration of my exile. Strangely enough, going to Germany to find it. But it was through that, to all those desolated houses of Berlin, at that time, really, it was, you felt that you were walking through a past
Yes.
that was still half animated in some manner. And
Did it take you back to that 1960s socialist Cuba in that sense?
oh yeah, it did.
Yeah.
It did, and it did in a way that by being unencumbered by my own specific history, I could see it with some distance. And I was very grateful for it. But that's why Berlin was so important to me at that time. And also what was happening to Germany as a whole was very informative.
Yeah, and I have to say that language is very resonant for me. I mean, I keep coming back to this now wherever I am, wherever I feel like we're living in this big moment of public life. And, the end of epochs, the beginning of something that you can't quite understand, the consequences of displacement, that's very resonant language for this moment in the 21st century, I feel. I don't know, do you think of it? And I feel like, as you say, the places you've come from, the places you've been, also you have a certain perspective on that can be useful.
I mean, one of the consequences of being in exile is that in some ways you gain the world in many ways, and in gaining the world, whether it's I can find in Dostoevsky or I can find in Paul Celan or in Harry Martinson, some pointer to that sense of displacement. Martinson's case, trying to find a mother who left, and you see, in Paul Celan sort of mining through sort of all that German history, or Dostoevsky sort of in his own struggle with life itself. I think in many ways, I feel that the freedom that comes with being in exile is to take all these different ways of looking at these problems of displacement and loss, and then incorporate it as my own, and without necessarily trying to tie it up to specifically the Cuban exile experience. But I do feel that this is a moment in which a conversation has been narrowed to sort of create this sort of simplistic opposition between locals and the other. And I think that it's more complicated than that. I mean, I think one of the things that I'm most interested in is to find the strangeness in each of us.
The strangeness.
The strangeness, the
Yes.
sense of otherness
Yes.
in us. I mean, I think that we all carry a burden of otherness, of not being a local, so to speak. And I think getting in touch with that will make this simplistic opposition disappear somewhat, or completely, if we look at it closely enough.
One thing you said about when you moved to Puerto Rico, is that where you went when you left Cuba when you were 7?
I went to Spain.
You went to Spain,
Yeah,
and then
Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico, you were there as a teenager. You said, unlike Cuba of the 1960s, which had this aspiration of an envisioned future, Puerto Rico, you said, was not a place that had an envisioned future. It was you had a sense of waning. And then you said something interesting, that because faith in the system had withered, subjectivity thrived. That's such an interesting observation.
I mean, it was so. It was and remains a place that didn't have the belief in the laws as maybe Americans used to think of them. And I think everybody had their own sense that their own view, their own opinion, their own version of the truth somehow should prevail. And then the question is that subjectivity? I mean, I think that...
That sounds kind of familiar, too.
Well, it's becoming increasingly familiar. I think around the world.
Yeah.
The sense that, I think the subjective is when deeply accepted as a burden, as a responsibility, can lead to truth. And in fact, perhaps is really the only way to truth. But it's also a way to locate differences, to feel that from that subjective point of view, difference between people, difference between ourselves and others, becomes sort of the defining factor of what we call the subjective.
Right.
And I think some of that, it was what I saw as a teenager. And some of that is what I see now.
Mm-hmm. You've also said that, you've also spoken of the age of narcissism that began in the 1960s. I wonder if you'd say a little bit more about that. And do you feel that where we are now is also, has also been engendered by that narcissism?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has become very sort of commonplace to speak of the 60s and 70s as sort of an age of narcissism. Mm-hmm. But if that was the birth of it, we are living in the fully entrenched maturity of it.
Yeah.
So we have only been magnified by social media, by all these other methods of, one central quality of narcissism is not this notion of loving oneself, but the incapacity to love, which is at the heart of narcissism.
Right.
And that incapacity to love is really an ailment that one can feel around, which steals away the capacity for empathy and relating to someone else as something other than a subject or an oppositional force. So I think that what has happened in the last 15 years, where we do not exist unless there is a camera looking at us, mm-hmm. the growth of reality television, the sense that people see a bird, they want to photograph it before seeing it, that sort of mediation of media has only exacerbated mm-hmm. the sense of narcissism that exists in the culture. And the end result is not only the capacity for love, but cruelty. And cruelty has become really something that one sees and hears a lot more about in many different ways. Sometimes in a subtle way, or let's call it apparently harmless, such as certain kinds of jokes, certain kind of comedy, and in other ways that are more terrifying. And I think that is an outcome of this growth of narcissism. Mm-hmm. And let me just add to that, the art world is not an oppositional force to this, but rather very much at the center of this narcissism.
Right. For you, art is ethical, but it's not necessarily ethical.
Right.
And you're right. I mean, as you say, the art world can also be an especially interesting, colorful expression of this narcissism.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about the arts is that you cannot really use any kind of generalized, pluralistic view of it.
Right.
When people say they like the arts, it's like people say they like religions. It's somewhat meaningless.
Right.
So I think that there are most of the things that people engage with is some art activity which is increasingly connected to commerce and trade and auctions and so on. So I'm not so interested in that version of it. I'm interested in art as sort of connected to ethics, as an ethical activity. And in that sense, I think one of the reasons to do that is because this narcissism we speak of, we all have it. I have it. I mean, this is part of a condition, and And I think what art can offer is the possibility of seeing oneself reflected in the work in this way, and then work towards the possibility of imagining something beyond that, beyond that narcissistic concern with the image.
I'd love to talk about religion and the term religious, what that means for you. And I think actually where we are, it flows right into that. I mean, I see the way you use the term religious, I see it connected to connotations of consciousness, also of an awareness of moral failings, of emotional ambition and seriousness. I don't have a sense. This is not something that you overtly speak about or reckon with. So, I mean, just talk to us a bit about what religion means for you, both for you and also how you see it alive in the world and connected to these subjects we've been discussing tonight.
So, the religion of my childhood. I had a contentious relationship to that religion of my childhood. But even though I had a contentious relationship with it, it mattered to me. You know, you're not content with things that don't matter to you. Mm-hmm. So I wrote all these essays, you know, on the nature of God. All this, I mean, they were terrible. They were like, I was 13 or so, but they, yeah. I was after something, and then I saw it through my life and in many different ways. And when I want art to do what religion does for my parents and for people who are believers. A certain inquiry into truth, a certain clarifying force in one's life, a certain guide. And that's how I have approached it. And that's why I sometimes react when people ask me what the work is about. I mean, nobody asks what religious experience is about.
Right.
They just, if they ask something, it's how does it come about? And I think I find sort of like Wittgenstein that even though I'm myself not religious, I look at life from a religious point of view. With that the questions that people usually address in religion are the ones I want to think about and talk about, not only in my work, but in my work.
You know, when we were talking earlier on about your idea of a painting, that their meanings, images fight back and their meanings play hide and go seek with materials, it seems to me that it's kind of a way to move through the world, also seeing meaning that is playing hide and seek with materials. I mean, did you say that's you as an artist, but it's also, as you just said, it also describes a religious way of moving through the world.
Yeah. I mean, and there's a secret in all things, and that secret that is in everything, in my shoe and everything there is, I think makes life and reality and the moment so full, so vast, that only the kinds of attitudes that people describe as sort of religious attitudes have the possibility of approaching that fullness with any kind of sincerity and with any kind of possibility of getting anywhere.
There's you sometimes say that artists should be prophets, and then you often qualify it in saying minor prophets, at least. And I like the way you define that, because you don't define it as being mystical. You actually did a lecture in 2009 called The Prophet, and you drew on Pushkin and Khalil Gibran, and you wrote The prophet is not a martyr or mystic who seeks transcendence, but one who turns humbly and curiously towards the world.
I mean, I think there is a tendency in not just in our moment. I mean, Kierkegaard made the distinction between the apostle and the genius, 170 years ago. But there's a tendency for us to think that to be a prophet or to do anything grand, you have to have a special gift, be someone called for. And I think ultimately what really matters is the resolve to want to do it, to give your life to that which you consider important. And if you have no skills to offer or nothing special to offer, it's all the more amazing that you do it, the more remarkable. And I think that resolve is all that really matters. And in the specific case of art, I think the notion that to bring the future forward by throwing yourself desperately, I think desperation is part of what I consider a prophet to have. Once you have made that resolve to launch yourself forward, then desperation is the only factor. Urgency, desperation. There's no way to calculate. Calculation doesn't go with prophets. So he has very little else that is required. And I'm not. And the reason I made the distinction between minor prophet is because I'm not trying to put any capital letters here or trying to say that you're going to be remembered as such, because it really doesn't matter. It's a private journey that no one needs to really know about.
There's you use the word whisper a lot. Do you know that in your
I
writing?
didn't know that.
The whisper of the order of things. Again, the order. And then you said somewhere, the whisper is faint, but the best art helps us to hear it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason why I use whisper is because maybe I have little ears, but it seems that both in science and art and anything, the truth are not screaming that much, and I think that you have to be attentive, silent enough, be able to look and listen very, very carefully, and even then, you have to be very lucky to hear something. But when you do hear something, it's transformative, and that order of things, that more stable reality underneath the appearance of things, is life-changing. So, and I think scientists will say that's the case, and I think poets, and I think theologists. I mean, I think everybody agrees that truth is requires some suppressing of other things to see it.
It's interesting to ponder that right now, where truth itself is such a kind of fraught concept. And also because we're all so trained to be noisy, right? To raise our voices. And to think of truth, real truth, as something that we'll be whispering. And so that part of the way we have to let it into the world or attend to it is to be more quiet, more gentle.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't lend itself naturally to many of what we hear in the culture as a whole, where authority, titles, how loud you scream, how important you seem to be, is given too much credence. I mean, going back to what I said before, the notion that the popularity of your site, or the popularity of your Instagram account somehow determines the wisdom of your words or something. And I think we are challenged, and especially, I would say, even more so, the younger, my kids are challenged by all these demands, to the point that to even talk about something that exists underneath all that, like a rustle of leaves or something, underneath that whole scandal.
Or the whisper of the order of things.
Or the whisper of the order of things.
Yeah.
That is something that not only sounds foreign, but the kind of concentration and also the kind of giving up of many of the things we hold dear and we have been taught to love and demand and wish for and crave, is a tall order. And I think most people don't think that the whisper of the order of things is that desirable, that they're willing to give up so many things for it.
It's nice to talk about that in this space, isn't it? In this contemplative space. It makes sense here in a way that it would be hard to make sense in a lot of our public spaces. This is something kind of completely different, but we just have a few more minutes, and I do want to ask you about this. You, and I don't really know the story here, but it sounds like you moved, the strengths and pitfalls of color is the topic. It sounds like you've kind of moved away from and towards color in your life, and then you kind of moved away from color and re-embraced it after the birth of your children in a new way.
Yeah, I mean, I started as an apprentice for a painter, very sort of traditional paintings. And in the late 80s, I destroyed all my paintings, I burned them, and I felt that, physically, like actually burning them, I felt like I had to build painting from the ground up. And I think eliminating color, I eliminated out of my painting anything that anybody have ever said that I was good at. So if I was good at drawing, I took it out. If I was told I was, had facility with color, I took it out. And then I said, well, if I give up all these things, what is painting for me? So I'm very interested in the idea of being anti-facile in some ways, rejecting what comes naturally, or rejecting pleasure. So then I worked in black paintings for a long time. Although black is so seductive that in itself is a problem.
Right.
So it's too easy to be fetishistic about the rejection itself.
Right.
So I was fortunate to have children, and when they came, along with them, it came the reinvention of a new way of working to make sure that I was not getting too comfortable in that other way. And then with them, it came color over tar paintings, of all things. And it's still muted. I cannot make it a big triumphant return to color because it is relatively muted still.
Yeah.
But it is there.
I was thinking when I read that, I interviewed a few years ago a physicist, Arthur Zajonc, who's worked a lot with Goethe, who we think of as a poet, but in fact really thought of himself more as a scientist, right. And that that Goethe defined colors as the deeds and sufferings of light.
Yeah, I mean, all colors. I mean, really, all colors are just basically. I mean, light is the same. It's the same thing. Whether it's a red or a green, just slight shift will make one into the other,
yeah.
Depending on how you move in speed and so on. But yeah, I mean, colors. My kids are very interested in color, and they ask me all the time about them, and they cannot believe that I think brown is a nice color, for example. So
this is why we have children.
Yeah.
They set us straight.
Yeah. but I think that there's an emotional relationship that colors can bring about, and paintings are intricately connected to the notion of not absolute color, but local color, colors in relationship with one another. And I find this to be a profound part of the encounter with paintings. And the colors of paintings are always insignificant or relatively lame compared to nature. And yet, a lot of the great things of paintings is the constraint, the limitations. I mean, that's what makes them a creative enterprise. It's the constraints. A lot of people talk about art as freedom, when in fact it is the constraints that allow the possibility of art to happen. And color, constraint under the pressures of these relatively small dimensions, is beauty under compression, which is always an exuberant form of beauty.
I wanted to ask you about beauty. I wanted to. I don't actually think it's a word you use a lot, and maybe you use it sparingly on purpose.
Yeah, the problem with beauty is that we all have an opinion of what it is, right? And it's a word that is commonly used. Nobody necessarily goes back to sort of Immanuel Kant's idea of beauty when you use it. So people, when one says it, the other person says, "Oh, I know what you mean."
Right.
So I try to use other words around that are maybe less familiar. The same challenges with the word spiritual, because I think everybody thinks that they know what that means. So I use what I mean, the broken parts of it, and then don't say the summary word. I think the problem with beauty, spiritual, and so on is that they're summary words that summarize a certain kind of experience. But I think, but I am thinking about some of these questions.
Well, what are some of the words you use instead of beauty or spiritual to convey what those things mean to you?
I do things like the whisper of the order of things.
Yeah. Good. Yeah.
And I talk of experience, and I talk of transformation, and I purposely try to shock by using words like clumsy and awkward and raw and things like that that forces you to think a little bit more of what is being said.
Right.
Because if I say, this painting is very clumsy, you immediately think that I am saying something negative about it. And I never use things like somebody will say, "Oh, that painting is very static." A static painting can be very beautiful. It's not in itself a criticism. So I try to clean these words from their usual association by adding other words to it.
But so if you said something was clumsy, and would that be, and you might think it's beautiful, but it would be a way to have people look at it, to pay attention? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a awkwardness and clumsiness is a way to get at something authentic sometimes, when slickness and facility are not the way. You have to go around them.
Right.
So when I will describe one of my paintings as awkward or clumsy, self-aware in that sense, I think I want people to sort of look at it and say, why will anybody want to do that? And then in that dialogue, there's the possibility of maybe some connection with something. I never want to have the kind of artwork that winks at someone, that sort of we're both in on the joke. I find that kind of artwork to be lacking in some ways. So when I say this is clumsy, I don't mean that I was trying to be cute. by creating some artifice, but rather that this is the only way through something. And sometimes I would not be saying it by meaning like I could do it better if I wanted to, which is the other thing.
Yeah.
I'm just saying this is where I am, and I can't go any farther. This is as good as it gets.
And what about spiritual? What's some other language or other imagery that you use? I so agree with you that word is overused, and yet it's pointing at something so meaningful.
Yeah, that is one of the most challenging of all the words. So I have found sometimes to use the word spirit with the spiritual part to actually help a little bit to get somewhere. But what I try to do is speak of the actual end goal of what we describe as the spiritual. So when we say I'm having a spiritual experience, that doesn't say anything to me. So I try to say, well, what do I mean by that? What is happening to me? What is happening to what I'm engaging? And what kind of transformation is at play? And I try to describe those things. Mm-hmm. And I think if I do that, what I'm thinking is that you might take away what normally would be described as a spiritual experience without having that, with having something concrete about what actually occurred. It may be something as simple as a certain relationship with one of my kids, right, or a certain experience of with nature, or with some larger order. And I try to say what I mean by that. Mm-hmm. I find that language can be of great assistance in mediating experience, but also can be a way to hide and to obfuscate and to confuse experience. Mm. And I think learn language. Language that seems very informed is the most dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Where we assume that too much is conveyed by those words.
Yeah, and I think the transaction is dead. I say it, you think you know what I mean, and we're done.
Yeah.
And I think it's too much of a shorthand. Between summary and shorthand, mm-hmm, the entire communication is dead.
Mm-hmm. This isn't a final detour, but you have such an interesting view of, and you wrote about photography, and you wrote about this a lot in your Berlin experience. And it strikes me because now, and like for people in this generation and our children, photography is something, it's a momentary activity. It's almost synonymous with taking a picture. And you talked about, I hear whispers again, photographs whisper that to look at them is to lose or overhear something, that the chemistry of photography holds grief as a potential. I just think this is so interesting to think about memory and mourning, that there's so much going on in pictures, so much more meaning than we attribute now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when people look, say, at a portrait of somebody, we always think that what we're saying is that person is no longer. But in fact, what's really happening is that image is saying, you're not to me. It's the other way. It's us that do not exist for that photograph. Oh. And as such, there is a grief, a mourning of the loss of always built into a photograph. On my painting table, I have a photograph of Robert Frost with his son Carol. And Carol, many years after that photograph, Carol, in the photograph, Carol is maybe 13. Many years later, Carol committed suicide. And I have that photograph with two apples from Robert Frost orchard on my painting table. And I look at it every day. And I think that photograph knew everything that was to come, sort of in the leaning of Carol toward his father, and in the fence, in all of that. The future was there. And I look at it every day to figure out if I can catch it, in which part of it. So then, 3 inches away, I have a picture of my son and I. It's still unfolding. And I'm trying to understand how that photograph, who tells me that I don't exist for it, is holding sort of all that will be in this place. And I think that's what photographs can do in some ways. And like many other things, by taking so many photographs, by having it in our phones, we don't look at them carefully enough. So, and in fact, they have become sort of a testament of having lived, when in fact what photographs do is say you're no longer. So
This is too deep for 9 p.m. So, a simple, actually a ridiculous question to end, but the question is really how you would start answering this question of through the life you've lived and the work you do, the way you walk through the world as a scientist / artist / philosopher. How would you start to answer the question how you think now about what it means to be human, how your sense of that has evolved to at this point?
I think the thing that is most pressing that comes up when you ask that question is compassion. I think not because it comes naturally, but because I think in some ways because it doesn't, to me. And I find that at this age, with 4 kids and with a world that everywhere one turns, and not just in the news, in just about every encounter with every person is carrying something. And I think what I'm reminded constantly is to be human, is to be aware of that. And that compassion is maybe the defining quality of what it means to be human for me at this point in my life. More than intelligence, more than anything else. And it's increasingly urgent and increasingly hard to remember that. I
like how you describe it also, not as a quality, but as a work in progress.
Yeah, it is a work in progress. It's, this morning I was seeing a man eating from a garbage can in halfway between Brentwood and Bel Air, two expensive neighborhoods of LA, and everybody, driving by and so on, and I was thinking, what will it take for somebody to stop and do something about it? But nobody did, and I didn't. And I think that our familiarity with those images and our capacity to survive them, to move on, is remarkable to me. And it seems to me that that's what is most needed, and when you ask me that question, what I think about means to be human now.
Do you consider yourself to be a hopeful person? Is hope a word you use? I think hope is in some ways
sort of a heroic human quality, especially in light of what life sometimes brings.
Mm-hmm.
But perhaps it's the best thing we have to sort of have the heroism of waking up in the morning, brushing our teeth, and saying, you know, that something will be possible. That being said, I don't describe myself as hopeful. I think hope is another of those works in progress, you know, and for some people, it seems amazing that they can sustain hope against atrocities and, you know, oppression and so many horrible things. But it's also amazing when people are hopeful when they have a menial job they hate, or a terrible family life, mm-hmm. and then somehow still have this remarkable human capacity to still think that tomorrow will be better. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, that's what I try to take on of empires. They create the idea that the future will be better as today. There's a certain wonderful thing, and also a terrifying thing, a denial of the present that comes with hope. And sometimes that's the only thing we have. But I turn that one around constantly in my head.
Mm. Well, Enrique Martinez Celaya, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you
I
all for
really
coming.
enjoyed it.